the fact of the matter is we never really had free speech in the UK.
I think what you're now starting to see on the right is right wokery, because there are some on the right, and I'm not one of them, but there are some on the right who say, okay, you want to play that game? Let's play that game.
I get countless racist comments all of the time from people saying that I don't belong in the UK and that because of my North African heritage. I don't think that those people should be arrested.
Welcome back to the Left, Right and Reasonable podcast. Joining me are two brilliant free speech thinkers. We've got Reem Ibrahim and we've got Douglas Carswell. I think there's a bit of disunity at the moment in Britain. Let's start with the basics. Free expression in the UK is protected under Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, but it's a qualified right. That means that the state can restrict for reasons like national security or protecting others' rights. So at a glance, to both of you, how would you describe the health of free speech today? Reem, do you want to start us off?
Yes, I mean, I think it's pretty utterly abysmal. But the interesting part about this is that the increase in restrictions on free speech we've seen haven't actually come from new laws. I mean, a lot of the laws that people are being arrested on these days have come from laws that have been on the statute book for years. So, what's interesting is when we're looking at this as a whole, it's about 33 people a day that are being arrested for online speech. 33 people a day. That's absolutely insane. Now, not all of those people, most of the people don't end up getting convicted, but the fact that they are then being restricted in their freedom of expression, they're restricted in their speech, the idea that speech itself can be a crime, I think is really what has now started to permeate society. So we're in a situation where a lot of the legislation that has been on the statute book for a very long time has now been used for malicious uses. So there's a couple of different pieces I just wanted to mention. So Section 19 of the Public Order Act from 1986, that's one that a lot of people are being arrested on the basis of. And it says that, and I quote, a person who publishes or distributes written material which is threatening, abusive, or insulting is guilty of an offence if A, he intends thereby to stir up racial hatred, or B, having regard to all the circumstances, racial hatred is likely to be stirred up thereby. I'm not even really sure what it means when it comes to something being likely to be stirred up. Section 127 of the Communications Act from 2003. A person is guilty of an offence if he sends by means of a public electronic communication network a message or other matter that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene, or menacing character. Now, I've used a lot of language that's pretty obscene. I've not yet been arrested for it, but and then any person who sends to another person, this is from Section 1 of the Malicious Communications Act from 1988, a letter, electronic communication, or article of any description which conveys a message which is indecent or grossly offensive. So a lot of these terms are extremely subjective, but again, the years I've just reeled off, we're talking about the 1980s and the early 2000s. This legislation has already been on the statute books for a very long time, but it's only recently the culture of freedom of expression has completely died in the UK because there are those fears that somebody can actually be arrested. Now, there are a couple of different high profile cases that I think are really interesting to talk about. There is the Lucy Connolly case. So she was sentenced to 31 months in prison. 31 months. 31 months. I still can't wrap my head around that. For a single tweet. She sent out a single tweet where she was extremely angry, as many of us were, at the absolutely disgusting murder of 8-year-old girls at a Taylor Swift themed dance class last summer in Southport. And as lots and lots of people were, but of course, as a mother, she was, of course, extremely upset at what had happened. And she tweeted something along the lines of, I want the hotel to be the hotels where the asylum seekers are being held to be burnt down and take the government with them for all I care. She went on a walk, deleted the tweet after 4 hours, and she was sentenced 31 months for that one single post, that one single social media post. So, look, I mean, the situation we're in is pretty abysmal. I think that the fact of the matter is we never really had free speech in the UK, and we sort of I think took for granted the fact that culture was on our side, the fact that there was a cultural acceptance that people would say things we didn't like or didn't agree with, and we would be okay with that. And I think we sort of took that for granted. Now the culture has changed, and so existing legislation is being used against us.
And I think, that I would totally agree with that. It seems like a lot of the Blairite legislation is being used as well, the anti-terrorism things that were brought about. And there was this kind of, I guess, gentleman's agreement almost between the government and the people that we're not going to use these laws against you if we dislike your speech. This is for the bad people.
Yeah.
Douglas, do you want to add to that as well? Because this is something that you have highlighted and actually written about extensively in terms of your want for freedom of speech to be more strongly guarded in British legislation.
Free speech isn't just another freedom. It's the bedrock freedom, if you like, because in a free society, all your other freedoms are contingent upon people being able to express different views and have a competition of ideas. And if you suppress free speech, you suppress the ability for people to think freely. It's no coincidence that in America, free speech is guarded by the First Amendment. It is the bedrock freedom. There's no question that in Britain, free speech is under attack. As Reem eloquently said, there are a number of laws, some dating back to the late 1980s, that are increasingly being used to punish people for saying things that many of us may find offensive. In fact, the legislation makes it illegal to say things that are grossly offensive. I hope that many of the things that I say people will find grossly offensive. I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't challenging some people's sensibilities. The issue I think we need to ask is why is it the administrative state and the judiciary, which adjudicated on the basis of legislation that's been on the statute books for some time, has suddenly sort of taken leave of its senses? I think part of this is because there's now a new generation of judges who just don't have any notion of judicial restraint. They're activist and they have given up, I think, in the Lucy Connolly case and others like it, all pretense at administering justice neutrally. Justice in the hands of many of the judges in the wake of the riots last summer was clearly administered by judges who were punishing people in order to keep the chavs in line. That's basically what they were doing. And I think that is an extremely dangerous position for our judiciary to get into. So I think the restrictions on free speech owe a lot to the creation of a judicial appointments commission. So judges are now appointed by a quango of judges. I think also the College of Policing is one of the nefarious and sinister organizations involved in this. They have issued guidelines and training to police officers that clearly is driving this problem. Now, you started off, Jason, by saying we had signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights, which safeguarded free speech. Forgive me, but the ECHR and all that plethora of Euro human rights wasn't worth the paper it was written on. The one occasion there was a real mass infringement of people's human rights in Britain, namely during the lockdown. So I have absolutely no truck that the ECHR and human rights lawyers will ever be an effective vehicle for safeguarding our liberties. We need to ask, what is it we need to do, not just to change the legislation, but to deconstruct, to identify, and to fundamentally destroy the power of evil activist leftist judges and the College of Policing, because they are driving this move towards tyranny. It's not, as Reem identifies, legislation so much that's changed. It's the creation of this really malevolent force. To put it into context, you may think I'm overstating my case by calling them evil. No, I think they are evil. Why do I think they're evil? I think they're evil because more people were arrested for what they posted online in Britain last year than in communist China. I would call the regime that runs communist China evil. I think the tyrants in the College of Policing and the judiciary who have driven this attack on free speech in Britain are evil, and we need to treat them as evil, and we need to remove all moral legitimacy from them, and we need to rein them back, and we need to do so very aggressively, very unapologetically.
So where do we go from here? Because both Labour and Conservative governments have passed laws restricting speech. As we've identified here as well, there is more it is the continuation of using old legislation as well. Is there something wrong with our political class as well, that these aren't being challenged. I'm sure, Douglas, you're, I guess, very let down by the party that you once were part
Yeah.
of, the Conservatives. What has gone wrong there?
Well, looking at how the last government of the Conservatives under Boris Johnson brought in the Online Safety Act. Nadine Dorries famously made it one of her things, and it was apparently going to stop predatory people attacking children or some such nonsense. And anyone who questioned the wisdom of the Online Safety Act of 2023, which gave Ofcom extraordinary sweeping powers to police harmful content, was told that they were on the side of paedophiles and drug dealers and what have you. The legislation was brought through by people who should have known better, and everything that happened was predictable and predicted. So I think there needs to be a moment of reckoning. I think we need to formally investigate why it is that Boris Johnson and Nadine Dorries signed up to something so inextricably stupid and foolish.
But
They're
also, why
clearly,
has Reform UK now accepted Nadine Dorries with open arms?
yeah,
I mean, that was particularly shocking.
yeah. There needs to be this moment of reckoning with Johnson and Dorries and others. But I think we also, there need to be consequences for doing things like this. But I think also there needs to be some sort of formal investigation about the College of Policing. Because I suspect that a lot of what happened in the wake of the riots a couple of years ago, I think was clearly orchestrated. And I strongly suspect that if you were to have full discovery of all the communications from chief constables, Chief Constable of Essex and others, and the College of Policing, I think you would find things going on that would be more akin to what you would expect in communist China than in a free democracy. I think there needs to be that process of legal discovery, and I think heads need to roll.
Mm. So just kind of continuing this discussion then, um, what would the future of legislation look like? Because obviously at the moment, as you said there, the European Court on Human Rights is not doing the job that it was supposed to have. Douglas, you've kind of said in the past that in essence, it is a good bit of legislation, but it's just not enforced properly. So what would the future of British free speech be guarded by properly then?
Yeah, quite rightly, Reform and the Conservatives are come to the view that we need to leave the ECHR. That's like duh, that's obvious. But that is not going to fix the problem. The problem, I think, at the root cause are the judges. We like to think of judges as being learned, wise people who study the law in great detail, who are detached and mature enough to sit in judgment and apply the law fairly. I'm afraid that image of judges just doesn't really exist across large swathes of the British judiciary. There are some judges like that. Um, but clearly, there are some judges who are incapable of making those sorts of dispassionate application of the law as it stands. So I think I'm afraid to say I think the problem it's not just a case of saying you need a British Bill of Rights or you need a British version of the American First Amendment. You need to recognize that many people sitting on the bench in Britain are fundamentally hostile to the notions of liberty under common law. And I think you need to terminate a lot of those careers. I argued in a essay I wrote for the Telegraph that pretty much every judge who's ever been appointed under the auspices of the Judicial Appointments Commission must be made to reapply for their job. You obviously need to get rid of the Judicial Appointments Commission. And I think in that process of purging the judiciary, you need to be willing to. I mean, there'll be hysterical attacks on you for doing it. People will say you're on the side of tyranny. No, no, no. The Judicial Appointments Commission appointed judges are the tyrants. For the sake of our liberties, for the sake of our freedoms, for the sake of our country, we need to regard them. We need to treat the judges the way that Margaret Thatcher treated the National Union of Miners. They're a parasitic force that need to be isolated and politically destroyed.
Um, I guess to add to this, Reem, what would be a, I guess, safe timeline? Because for me, looking at this, the ECHR at least offers some sort of accountability to the government, as we've kind of discussed. Though in reality, that hasn't happened. But what happens if you remove that legislation? Um, there's just going to be a gap there. Who's going to hold the government to account? There has to be, if we followed down Douglas's kind of timeline here of the judges and the removal and removing ourselves from the ECHR, there'll be a gap there where tyranny could come in, that our rights get even more removed. And also the point that we're going back to is we have a political class at the moment who is opposed to that. We're kind of trusting in individuals that we know have failed us time and time again.
Yeah, I mean, my lack of trust for politicians is basically why I'm a libertarian. So I'm with you on that front. I think, and I'd be interested to know what Douglas thinks about this, but I think we need a First Amendment. I mean, I effectively think that if we don't have the constitutional right to freedom of expression, now in the US, it's interesting. The First Amendment hasn't always been as concrete, I suppose, as it is now. Before the 20th century, really did freedom of expression wasn't as concrete as we might describe it as today. But I would say the Brandenburg versus Ohio case is one of the most interesting and probably the sort of example of free speech that I believe in. So the idea is, is the particular thing that somebody is going to say, so they call it the Brandenburg test as a result of this case. If there is evidence of imminent lawless action, then that is the sort of hard rule against what incitement looks like. And anything else can go. Everything else is legal speech. But if there is like a genuine case for imminent lawless action, if there is evidence that that is likely to occur, then that is when speech can be used to prosecute somebody. So, for example, a military general commanding his military officers to go and rape and pillage a village, that speech is not protected under the First Amendment, for example. So I think it's interesting. There definitely is a line, and I think that's how I would describe the line to occur. But without a constitutional right to that kind of level of freedom of expression, you just can't guarantee it. Now, theoretically, the ECHR do that, but as you said, the fact that there is so much leeway has basically meant that it's the free speech elements of the ECHR have basically been completely useless to the UK. But all the stuff that has been particularly useful for asylum seekers has been particularly concrete. And I think that Douglas' assessment is absolutely right. A lot of it is activist judges that are they use the law in order to attempt to have some kind of outcome. I mean, we see this all the time where lots of lawyers are also creating. I mean, I'm thinking about the Good Law Project, Jolyon Moore. These are people that are using activism through the law in order to achieve political aims. And this is what's happening, that this is what has completely poisoned the British judicial system. So I think that in order for us to have like genuine civil rights that are being protected, there needs to be a fundamental constitutional right. And this is something I've changed my mind on, by the way. I mean, I think that parliamentary sovereignty is really quite beautiful. There is something wonderful about the British uncodified constitution that develops over time. Unfortunately, I just don't trust the people of the future in power. I don't trust the government enough. I don't trust parliamentarians enough to not take away our freedoms. So to protect freedoms, I think we need a codified constitution that protects it.
I think just to add to this as well, we need to talk about not just the freedom of speech, but also the freedom of right to protest, the freedom of right to strike. Because from a libertarian perspective, again, we've seen the legislation, the government kind of coming down on protesters and peaceful protesters as well. So once again, the kind of language used from the media as well, but also the government is, we need to stop these people disrupting our way of life.
Yes. And also, I mean, the hypocrisy on the right is absolutely astronomical. I remember getting into a massive argument with a GB News presenter who was saying that the Palestine protesters need to all be arrested and how dare they shout Palestine will be free on British streets. And I remember saying, sorry, I thought that you were supporter of freedom of expression. And again, it can't just be free speech that you like. What is it? Is it the Oscar Wilde quote? "I'll defend to the death your right to make an ass of yourself." I might not like what you say, but my God, you have the right to say it. And that also applies to groups and organizations that we perhaps don't like. Yes, a lot of the pro-Palestine marches in London especially have been a particular nuisance. Some of the things being said are a little bit annoying and I don't agree with it. But my God, I believe they have the right to say it, because what happens when we don't have the right to say things that people don't like? I think that it's really important that we apply that. And I've been really quite shocked. I think it's quite revealing, actually, that a lot of people on the right that are so-called free speech absolutists will ask for the police to arrest people they don't like almost immediately.
I quite agree with that. I mean, I find some of the mobs, or they're not mobs, they're crowds chanting Free Palestine slogans. I find it deeply offensive, but it's a free country. You should
Yeah.
be able to do that. You should have the right to be a jerk. I quite agree with you, and I'm very disconcerted when I see people urging the police to arrest people for saying things that are offensive. Now, you're absolutely right when you talked about the rules on incitement, Reem. The interesting thing about the First Amendment is it's not absolute. There is, and I think people recognize, a restriction on speech when it comes to incitement. If I was to urge a mob, whip up a mob into a frenzy to attack another group of people, quite rightly, that would be regarded as incitement. But you referred to that case in America. It's an incredibly the interpretation of incitement in America is very specific. It actually has to be imminent lawlessness, I think is the phrase you used, and the court ruled. In Britain, incitement seems to be interpreted by judges to mean something nasty and hurty that somebody somewhere found offensive. Now, that is not incitement. What is interesting, though, is we tend to, I think, in this debate, think if only we had the right amendment, if only we had the right phrase in the ECHR, all would be well. I think what the American example shows is that even with the most flowery libertarian constitutional amendment in the world, even if we cut and pasted the First Amendment in America and made it Article 1 of a new British Constitution, you still got the problem of who's going to interpret it round the edges on things like incitement. And so I don't think you can fix the problem without fixing the judges. Bear in mind, many of those states in communist East Europe used to have constitutions that safeguarded everyone's freedom and liberty, but it means nothing if you don't have people who are willing to apply that in ways that they might personally find uncomfortable.
Well, it's interesting also bringing it back to, I mean, Trump implemented, or at least attempted to pass, the executive order around flag burning, saying that it'll be illegal to burn the American flag, which of course is protected under the First Amendment, and there are countless cases of it. Texas tried to outlaw it years ago, and when it went to the Supreme Court, they were found to have been perfectly fine to do so. But it's just sort of the political posturing. Trump knew that it was sort of just a way to signal to his voters that he is pro-America first. I think what's interesting is the kind of whether or not you find something offensive. And Douglas, you mentioned the Online Safety Act. I think it's interesting because there was the clause in there about psychological harm, the idea that you could be prosecuted for causing psychological harm. And again, this is the completely subjective nature, and it's the idea that the victim decides whether or not something's a crime, because it depends on how they react to the particular statement, and it isn't dependent on the actual act itself. It's dependent on the consequences, which is just fascinating. And you're right, the American definition of incitement is a lot more specific, and I think the Brandenburg test is basically right. I think it's a pretty good indicator as to whether or not something should be protected or not. This guy was speaking at this like KKK event, and that's sort of where the court ruling came from. And I think it's right. A lot of people will say things I don't like. A lot of people will say things I find offensive. But my God, that's the price of freedom. You have to be willing to accept opinions that you may not like, or, you may not wish to be in the public arena, you may not wish to listen to. But you should have the right to say it without the government telling you you can't. And I also think that, to Douglas's point about kind of culture and the judges and whether or not, a lot of this isn't legal, a lot of it is really cultural. If we're in a society in which people do not believe in that kind of freedom, it's very, very difficult to obtain it. And unfortunately, I think a lot of British people tend to be quite supportive of a lot of the crackdowns on free speech. And actually, in the US, probably as a sort of long-term consequence of the fact that America started as an idea, is that, generally speaking, at least the Americans that I've met and known, have all been very supportive of freedom of expression. Even sort of hard left Democrats tend to be, more on the free speech side than the average British person, I think.